Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Travelers Rest. My name is Molly Stockdale, and I'm the Executive Director of Travelers Rest Connection. We are the nonprofit partner or friends group for Travelers Rest State Park. And we have the joy and privilege of hosting lots of programs and educational events here at the park, one of which is winter storytelling, where you are today. So thanks for joining us. I'm just going to ask that the folks on Zoom let us know if they're having any trouble hearing us today. And Becca's going to wave a big hand if there's issues with Zoom. We'll begin today's program, as we do, by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the homeland of the Séliš people at a place they named Timsumclee. Their example as the original stewards of this land guides our work today. Travelers Rest Connection is committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the indigenous people who lived and traveled through the ancient crossroads on this land. We learn from many indigenous elders, artists, and organizations. We invite you to learn from and support them as well. I want to say a quick thank you to everyone who makes these programs possible. The members of Travelers Rest Connection through their donations, sponsors like Marsh McLennan, Montana Public Radio, and MCAT, Missoula's community media resource, who provided a media assistance grant to record this session today. I want to thank today the Travelers Rest staff for providing treats out there. If anybody wants to provide treats for next week, you come up and tap me on the shoulder before you leave, okay? For folks joining via Zoom, it is helpful if you keep yourself muted and your video off during the presentation. If you have questions for our speaker, please type them in the chat box. We'll monitor the chat for questions and for any technical difficulties you might have. And now I'd like to introduce artist Leslie Van Millar. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
The third.
Good.
Okay. Is an independent visual artist who has been living and working in Western Montana since 1972. As a child, Leslie lived for 4 years in Iran and traveled extensively with her family through Europe. Leslie comes from a line of artists and scientists like that. Following graduation from Mount Holyoke, she pursued her interest in art making, incorporating both a scientific and investigative approach. Leslie's art has been shown in regional and national galleries and museums and is included in numerous public and private collections, including the Federal Reserve Bank of the Northwest United States, the University of Montana, the Junt Art Museum, and the Missoula Art Museum. Leslie is the recipient of several Montana Arts Council grants, 5 fellowships to the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and other exhibition awards. She performs as Science Woman, her alter ego, and is a member of Montana Conversations Speakers Bureau at Humanities Montana, who is generously supporting her appearance here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Leslie Millar.
I'm going to time this so I don't go on and on. You will be grateful. Yeah. So can you hear me now with this? Thank you. So I am Leslie Van Millar, and I feel very privileged to be able to talk to you about my art making process today because it involves many aspects that I think might be of interest to you, and one of them is that I am really motivated by why and how. And I think that artists ultimately are problem solvers, or at least that's my approach. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is going to have to do with how this series came about, the actual series, that will all be with the slideshow. And then we're going to have a conversation about some of the concepts and topics that I've brought up. And at the end, I have 2 of the peep shows that I'll be referring to in the back set up that you can actually experience what that is like, and you'll understand it better. And at the very end, if you would like to look at the postcards I brought and a book that was published around the series, that's also over there. So it's a lot of things going on. The most important of which is the feedback and questions and answers from you following the slideshow. Anyway, so to get on, next slide, I'm going to talk about the Caravan Project in a minute. This is myself at the age of 9 in Paris, looking at art on the Seine. And it's just to tell you that if you have children or grandchildren, start them out with art early, because I feel like I had a great advantage in the travels that my family did, and the fact that my mother's mother was an artist, so there was art around. My parents bought art, we talked about art, and that helped my budding identity as an artist. But we're gonna fast forward, next slide, to the mid-1990s. I'd been in Montana about 20 years, and a woman that is named Renee Westbrook, down here, came up with the idea of applying for grants from the NEA, West Taft, and the Montana Arts Council to have a traveling art show that went around the state in outdoor locations. So that is a big factor in what happened for everyone in the group, but especially affected how I approached the issue, because we didn't have walls and we didn't have protection from the weather. So all these 13 artists were from all over the state, and I have to say that a few of the artists that have participated in the residency program here were in that group. This is Steve Gluckert, and then Bev, and then in Missoula artists, Catherine Mallory, and Bobby Tilton. So Missoula was well represented, and I feel lucky because I got to know most of these artists through that experience. So the big deal was, how do you solve that problem? How do you show art, and especially mine, that is susceptible to damage from certain elements? So next slide. I used my father's technical expertise, as well as my husband, who is not pictured. This is my father, who was a chemical engineer but had an interest in engineering, period. So what I came up with, and it combined a lot of interest. I was interested in Montana history. I was interested in gouache painting, which I had been doing for about 20 years. I was interested in narrative art, which tells a story. And I was interested in peep shows. And at the time, when I talked about peep shows, you have to imagine this is 30 years ago. When I said I was showing peep shows, everyone assumed it was lurid and connected to New York City and girly shows and stuff like that. And I was like, no, I want it to be that you are peeping through a box and seeing a painting, which is protected from the elements because it's enclosed. It's got a black interior, so you're focusing on it. And it has a little light, which my dad is the genius behind that. He was like, okay, you're gonna use car brake lights. You know, they were really powerful. You can set up a battery, it's portable. Anyway, so I was acknowledging his assistance there. Next slide. So this is the front of the peep shows. Next slide, you would look through the hole and then you would see a painting. This is one of the ones that I brought today, like a highlight. And then next, this is the interior. I just thought you might be interested because that's where the electric lines going to the batteries connected and the bulb. Next slide. And then that's one of the paintings before it's attached to the back. So you can imagine with this caravan project, we were going into parks, parking lots, lawns, all sorts of different scenarios, and having to assemble our work in the morning, open up in the afternoon, and then strike camp later that day. It was a lot of work. And mine was in the mid-grade. We had some friends who literally, it took hours for them to assemble their stuff. And there was one artist that was really smart. He figured out how to just sort of pop open what he wanted. Michael Peed came up with the easy solution, but the majority of us had a lot of time required to assemble things. So next slide. This is actually what they look like. You'll see them there. And this is at the Missoula Art Museum, which is a show I'll refer to in a second. But next slide. This is from the Caravan Project. I think it was, you know which, it was in the Bitterroot, or in the Big Hole. Twin Bridges, yeah, it was Twin Bridges. We went there, and this is all the kind of assembling we did. Next slide. And those are some of the, this is at the Archie Bray Foundation. And next slide, this is all 1995. And at the time, I have to say, when I talked about combined interest, I was very interested in the late 80s and early 90s in Queen Elizabeth I. And I did a lot of research on her, and I dreamt that I would manage to make a dress that duplicated what she wore. I had no sewing skills. I didn't know anybody that I could do it. It would have probably cost me $1,000. It was way too complicated. So I had already been performing as Science Woman, and since I had used my science interest to come up with the apparatus for showing the paintings, I decided that I would present the work as Science Woman. Then I could be bossy and I could tell people how to do it and explain things. It wasn't, Science Woman has that opportunity. Anyway, so here I am as Science Woman with one of the peep shows outside, and then I had a sheep herder's tent that the remaining 4 were inside of. And during this trip, I got to know Steve Gluckert pretty well, and he is a native Montanan, which I am not, and he had seen the peep shows, of which there were 5. And the first has to do with England, and the other 4 were all Montana history. And he said, well, do you know about this incident in Montana history? And I'm like, no. And what about this? And he was talking about the more subtle regional things that weren't making the history books. They weren't war, they weren't politicians, they weren't big money things. They were like little incidents that actually had a big impact on the communities where those people or incidents occurred. So fast forward to, I think, next slide. Oh, sorry, that's another one. Somebody looking at the slide. Next slide. Yeah, and so 20 years later, I decided, based a lot on Steve's encouragement, to go ahead and do an additional 5 paintings. So 20 years later, I revisited the topic and managed to work with the Missoula Art Museum to set the paintings up. Now, this was different because they were inside, they were protected, they were regulated. So I had the luxury, if you see the person on the far right, they're looking at one that I was able to attach to a wall. I didn't have to worry about setting it up on a lawn or a gravel surface. So it changed things a little bit, but I was able to explore some of those more subtle events at this time. So next slide. Next slide. And it was very well attended. Children really, really liked it. And the exhibit kind of drove the museum staff crazy because the kids would come, and by the end of the day, all the batteries were depleted because they had spent so much time. Seriously, I mean, those guys were sort of annoyed with me for the first 2 weeks until they got into it and realized that was just what was going to happen because the school programs were coming through. But the kids really loved interacting with the switches and the novelty of the thing. So next slide. And then, so in this period when it was at the art museum, I was able to travel around the state to the Halter and to the Yellowstone Art Museum to show the work, and I decided I would start dressing up as Queen Elizabeth. So that's where we are today. I'm just about to get into the series. I'm going to help her switch. Okay, so, oh, the mic, sorry. Okay, I'm back on here, thank you. So with Montana Peep Show Stories, that's what I call the series. And I am going to show them to you in a chronological order. That's not how Queen Elizabeth time traveled. She was all over the place, but I'm taking liberty to make it simple for you. Okay, so we're going to start out on the first slide. So next slide, sorry. Queen Elizabeth would employ Dr. Dee's time machine in the bottom of Richmond Palace in Surrey, England, 1589. So to set the stage for this, during Elizabeth's era, she lived 69 years. She was born 1533, died in 1603, 45-year realm. It's huge. And from what I've read, her period in English history was probably the most stable and highly productive, which I think is kind of interesting that it was a female monarch that managed to pull that off. Okay, and so it was the period of exploration. She had all these young men that she liked to sort of flirt with that were interested in furthering their career by offering their skills to her, mostly like capturing prize ships and exploring other territories. But she also was friends and mostly consulted with a man named Dr. Dee. Let's start out with a picture of Elizabeth. Next slide. So there she is. She was a pretty amazing person, and I think the reason I was so attracted to her in the 1980s and the early 90s was because she was a powerful female figure who, if you start reading about her, she had to have been very highly intelligent because she navigated all this terrible political treachery very, very skillfully when lots of people were being executed or isolated, so they couldn't do anything. But she managed to stay singular and the queen by avoiding getting married, although she was under a tremendous amount of pressure. But that's part of why she had these male friends and consultants. Okay, so next is Dr. D. And one thing I wanted to point out is when I started studying this for the paintings in the mid-90s, there was no real internet, not in the way that we experience it today. And I was having to drive to Helena to go to the Historical Museum to look at photographs and artifacts there. I was having to go to the library in Missoula to obtain books. They had information, and I don't know that there's that much more information now than there was 30 years ago, although I suspect there is. But a lot of things were harder to come by. Now, when I was doing this series 10 years ago, the update, everything I could do online. I could find the photographs online, I could find the material online. But I suspect with Dr. D that I think some of these figures have received more attention and more scholarship since that time, because when I was reading about him 30 years ago, they kind of dismissed him as a pseudoscientist, an alchemist, which is where you're turning base metal into gold, and sort of like a crank. And reading about him more recently, there's a lot more credit given to him. And so he apparently was very influential with her from very early on in her monarchy. And one of the things he promoted was that she explore, that she get out there and compete with Spain and all these other places, other countries for dominance overseas. And he came up with the term British Empire. He had the largest library, private library in England called Mortlake at the time. I mean, he was a really knowledgeable guy. So it makes sense that he would have encouraged her to use a time machine to explore the New World, which is what my premise was. And then we have, next slide, Sir Walter Raleigh, who was one of those young men that was currying favor with her to obtain power, most likely, but they had a friendship and flirtation until he got married secretly. And then he was going into the New World as well. I mean, he was very instrumental in the settling of Virginia initially. So here we have the first painting. Oh, I'm sorry, back up. That is just like Dr. D with his apparatus, his alchemical apparatus. Yeah. So here she's in the time machine that Dr. D has invented, and Walter Raleigh is like, accompanying her to reassure her. So you've got here the solar system, and then the North American continent, and then Montana. So she picked Montana to come to. Yeah. So this is all we're going to do with England, but it's giving you that, she liked it so much she came back 9 times. So, yeah. So I have to tell you, I'm not going to talk about Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea a whole lot since we're in the hotbed of information, both in the gift shop and all around the displays. But I have to tell you, I did this painting in 1994. And when I did it, this did not exist. And I had heard that they had been here, this area, but nobody really could tell me where they were. And so I got in my car and I drove down to Lolo, and I was on the other side, the east side of the highway, tramping around in some farmers' fields to get an accurate sense of what the landscape was like. Which I'm proud of the fact that I was doing that. And honestly, again, like how things have amplified, there wasn't a lot of easy information about Sacagawea or recognition of her critical role. And now, 30 years later, there's a lot more understanding of how important she was. So I'm very happy that I made that effort. It's not actually completely accurate, but yeah. Next slide. So I included this one, and as my husband said, well, Lewis wasn't there, because they went back and forth. So the 1805 trip, all 3 of them were here. 1806, Lewis went off on his own. So what happened is when Elizabeth came, next slide, to here, this is around where I was photographing or drawing. Next slide. There she is. So she's there with Sacagawea and Clark, and they're in a beautiful landscape, and she liked it. Now, I have to say, every dress that Elizabeth has on was inspired by dresses that she wore. She had an extensive wardrobe, and she made sure she had a different dress on each time she came to visit Montana. Okay. So here we are in 1896. In the aftermath of the Civil War, they recruited black soldiers that were called Buffalo Soldiers. And out at Fort Missoula, there was an infantry brigade run by a white Lieutenant James Moss, who had this idea. The bicycles had recently kind of become part of the population. And he was convinced that if he could train soldiers to ride bicycles into warfare, that it would make a lot of sense. And so he was given this group of soldiers. You're kind of, yeah, I know. So again, when I did, this one's from 95 as well, I mean, nobody was talking about this stuff, and there was almost no printed material, and now there is a display that you should go see out at Fort Missoula with one of the bicycles, and some of their uniforms and stuff like that. Anyway, so he took a group of soldiers, next slide, and they practiced out at Fort Missoula. And they had to carry their tent, and they had to carry their food, they had to carry their weapons. I mean, there was like 40 pounds, I think, of stuff that they had to carry on bicycles that were not nearly as easy to ride as what would be now. Anyway, there are some great photos. Most of these photos are from the Historic Society. And this one, even though it's a terrible photo, I was amazed that they had it in their collection. I love the composition and everybody in a row. So I included that because I just thought it was beautiful. And then, so they made 3 major trips. They made their initial trip was pretty short. It was to Lake McDonald, I think. And then the second one was a big deal. They went down to Yellowstone, which was quite a distance. And the third and final expedition was to St. Louis, which was like 1,800 miles round trip. I mean, it was a really tremendous endeavor, and this was over a period of about 1.5 years, and the unfortunate thing happened that even though they were exemplary and the Moss was very complimentary about the ability of its soldiers and their endurance and just kind of amazing people, it got phased out because the US was getting ready to be in I think it's the Spanish-American War, and they were understanding that a truck, which vehicles were starting to become available at the same time as the bicycles, they could transport a lot more people easily with a truck than a bicycle. So the whole project got dropped. But you will see here, this is, so the Queen's in the middle. And then we've got Moss here, and then a bunch of the soldiers there. It's like kind of an interesting perspective. And there's a close-up. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, there she is. She's just a little taller than everybody because she's the queen. You know? Next. So I love photography. I started doing photography when I was 9 years old, and it's been something I've just chewed up and relished for a long time, both using it professionally and in a family way and lots of different ways. Anyway, so when I heard about Evelyn Cameron having been in Terry and had left this legacy of amazing glass plates, I became very interested in her to the extent that I went and visited the biographer or the woman that wrote the book and discovered the glass plates, Donna Lucy. Yeah, so the thing with Evelyn is she was, next slide, she was an aristocrat in England, and she met a man when she was pretty young who was already married, and I think they wanted to be together, and his first marriage did not sound successful. So that to avoid her family's criticism, plus she was kind of eccentric, I think they just went, okay, we're going to get out of here. So they came to the US, I think in the 1890s initially, and liked it enough that they decided to move there, and they ended up in Terry. Yeah, Terry, and you'll see Evelyn's here, she's dressed like that. Well, she wasn't dressed like that for long. She got really into being a homesteader and baking bread, and she really did all the hard work. Her husband was more, I think he had health issues and probably was just a more limited person, but he was an ornithologist, and so she would accompany him out into the field. they had a number of unsuccessful ventures, which were raising polo ponies and shipping them to England. I just can't even imagine a human going back and forth, let alone a bunch of horses. So that did not work out, and so they needed money, and they started taking in lodgers. And luckily, one of her lodgers had a large format camera and exposed her to it. And then after he left, she bought one, and then another lodger came through who actually knew a lot about printing photographs. And so she got into doing that as a way to supplement her income, and I think she obviously relished it. It was a love, an artistic love of hers. Next slide. So she started going out on her horse with this camera and documenting the people that lived there in the plains. So, it was the families or the workers or the celebrations, and it's just an amazing thing. So when I say Donna Lucy wrote this book about her, it was because Donna Lucy ended up in Terry somehow or another. Maybe she heard a rumor. And what had happened is Evelyn had bequeathed, she never had children, she bequeathed all her glass plates to a young woman that was sort of her adopted daughter. And that woman was elderly in the 70s. She was in her 80s, I think. All those plates were in the basement, not being taken care of, dusty, in boxes, I understand. And so Donna Lucy got down there, found them, and the rest kind of became history. But it was that emerging out of women's artistic skill and importance that all has happened in the past 50 years, in my opinion. Next slide. And I'm showing these because they kind of relate to the incident where Elizabeth visited. So she's here, and I've got Evelyn included because I thought that was very important. But yeah, they were having a very nice time here, kind of sparse, but it was sparse there. Next slide. And so Queen Elizabeth attended a stump speech of Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt was president. He was president, I think, 2 terms, and he left graciously at the end of that. Turned it over to Taft. And he didn't, and they were Republicans, and he didn't think Taft was doing a very good job. So when Taft was up for re-election, he tried to get the nomination, didn't really work. So he formed his own party to compete with Taft. And so he came through Missoula. But I have to say, previous to that, he had been coming to Montana since the 1890s. And he was instrumental in the creations of the national parks and was instrumental, they don't give him total credit, but he was obviously instrumental with Yellowstone. And so he had been out here, in and out of here several times, and he obviously liked it. Anyway, here you'll see, he was in Missoula on the corner of Broadway and Higgins with the building that's still there. Next slide. And this is by McKay, who was a photographer predominantly in the Missoula area for about 40 years. He did really amazing photographs that are documenting what was there. But I like the fact that Teddy was obviously well received by the population. Next slide. But here we got Elizabeth up there on the balcony. So one thing, you'll notice it's in another painting I'm going to show. I mean, in some of these earlier scenarios, she was sort of amazed at how many men there would be in the audience. So you'll see that there's very, very few female figures. I think there's a couple over here. But it's like the sea of hats. Yeah. And that gives you a sense of how things have changed. Next slide. So one of my favorite stories, and again, we used to take the train regularly from Shelby, so I got kind of interested in Shelby, and trains are an important factor. So Jack Dempsey was the world heavyweight champion in the 1920s. And this, again, I've just learned more just recently, refreshing my memory. So apparently he had a handler or agent named Kern who was somewhat unscrupulous, okay? So Dempsey was actually a really good fighter, but he had made a plan to fight in Canada for a very large amount of money. So it made a lot of the papers. It was like well known. So the people in Shelby who were starting to feel their oats because they had oil coming in the region and they were starting to have some money, were feeling very confident. they were like, okay, we're going to ask if he wants to come here and fight. He'll never do that, but we're going to do that so we get national publicity. Well, they did it, and he said yes. And then all of a sudden, they had $100,000, which was a fortune at that time, to come up with. And through a series of kind of convoluted transactions where they tried to kind of back out of it, and it just was poorly handled, but they ended up owing $300,000 for this fight that they had imagined, because the railroad was there and they were feeling strong, that they would get all this national publicity and at least people would come and pay for those seats. But because of all these negotiations over the greatly exaggerated fee, the publicity was funky. They didn't get the turnout they thought they would. So next slide. So this is the stadium they built, and in the aftermath of the fight, it was such a disaster that the entire stadium was demolished. And apparently some of the buildings in Shelby still have remnants of the wood from this, but it's not obvious. So what happened is they had expected 40,000 people, and they ended up with about 17,000 people, most of whom were people that lived in the area and didn't pay anything. And they were all on the exterior, fenced exterior area of the thing, not paying fees. And then when the fight started, everybody rushed the gate. And so they... So I have to say, I feel sorry for Shelby. It was a big blow. Like, the people that had promoted it initially were the mayor and the mayor's son and the bankers, and I think all the banks failed after that. It was a serious blow to their economy. And they really, in the 90s, when I started researching it, they didn't really want to talk about it. They were embarrassed about it. And now they're going, okay, whatever. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, so next slide. So one of the things I found out is that to try and recoup this huge amount of money that they were having a hard time with, they managed to get an agreement that it would be filmed, which in the 1920s was probably pretty unusual, because they had hopes of being able to at least distribute that. And then belatedly, they found out that they could not show or sell boxing movies beyond the state where it was where it originated. So it was like, who was going to pay, or who was the audience? It was pretty limited if you're talking about Montana. So they didn't make money, but there is actually film footage of the fight, which is interesting. So here we have, that's Tommy Gibbons, and that's Jack Dempsey. And Tommy Gibbons was picked because they were pretty confident he would not win, but he was amazing, and he was a very kind person. He came back to Shelby for many years following it. I think he was from Minnesota or Michigan, maybe Minnesota or Wisconsin. But he was a good guy. He became a sheriff where he lived, and he always liked the people in Shelby. They liked him because he practiced boxing in Shelby, and Dempsey and his corrupt manager were in Great Falls having the high life. So it's kind of interesting. And Tommy Gibbons did not come away with any money, basically, just got expenses. Next slide. So here we have them. And the cool thing is, probably a paying customer was Charlie Russell. So we've got Charlie Russell right here, and we've got the Queen up here. So Charlie Russell was one of the legitimate people that came in and witnessed this thing. Next slide. So there's next slide. There's Charlie. He's got a ringside seat, and then next slide. I also, as kind of a bonus, I did a painting to contribute to the Missoula Art Museum's auction in that same period of time in the 90s. So I did a close-up, next slide, of the Queen. This was never a peep show. I think it went to Sharon Alexander. I mean, so it's in her collection. Next slide. Okay, we're moving along. So now Jeanette Rankin. Let me see how I'm doing. Okay. And I'm sorry if I'm too long-winded. I'll try and move along. So Jeanette Rankin was very cool. She was born outside of Missoula. She was at the turn of the century, and then she was the very first woman in the Senate or the House of Representatives in the national government. It's a huge deal. And she was initially a suffragette, and she was really working for women's rights. And then when she was in there the first time during World War I, or the build-up to World War I, she was one of the very few votes against the war, because she was very much of a pacifist. and then took off when she lost that election or retired from that. She was a lobbyist for a period of time. And then in the build-up to the Second World War, same thing, she's in there. And then it was very unpopular for her to vote against the war. She was probably, I think she was the only vote against the war. And it was right after Pearl Harbor. So she retired after that. She was like, okay, that's not gonna happen. But she lived a long time, and she did a lot of good things, including starting a foundation to promote women in business. But I just read again, a new factor is that I think in 1968, she formed the Jeanette Rankin Brigade of 5,000 women who marched on Washington about the buildup in Indochina. So it was, I guess it was before we were officially, or we were just about to be in Vietnam. But I think that's pretty remarkable. She was 87. Yeah, so cool. Okay, next slide. So here she is when she's a suffragette. Next slide. And she went to University of Montana. She graduated from there. Next slide. And then this is her as an older woman. And then you'll see. The painting is based on the fact that she seemed to have a good time. I saw several photographs when I was in Helena at the Historical Society of her looking like she's having a nice lunch at the Broadwater Hotel in Helena. Yeah. Yeah, so I just thought, okay, they're gonna have tea. They're not gonna have a martini or whatever she was doing. Okay, next slide. Next slide. And when I talk about, like, the first set of paintings, I was really focusing on major events. But the second one, I was really looking at more local stuff. So this is more in the local category. So I found out that, just again, recently, there have been a tradition of pet and doll parades around the state in Great Falls, Helena, I think Shelby, and Missoula. And now the only one I think that's still operating is the one in Great Falls, which has been going on for almost 90 years. It's a long tradition. I think that the Wildlife Film Festival's Wild Walk Parade sort of fulfills a similar function in Missoula. But I just thought it was charming, and it's easily recognizable. So these are the photographs that inspired me. Yeah, and so this is down off of Higgins near the dry cleaners, and yeah. Next slide. So I decided, because artists have artistic license, this is my daughter and her friend Helen Belangi, and the cat that they used to put in a baby perambulator and stroll around the neighborhood. It's not exactly accurate, but it's close enough. And then on purpose, I made the queen really small. I was like, oh, she doesn't have to dominate every painting. She can be a bystander. Next slide. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was our cat, Pierre. Yeah. And then we're getting close to the end. So some of you may have experienced the Chapel of the Dove, and that was something that our family would routinely go to. I'm not talking about all the time, but it was that they had some of the most interesting movies in town. They were the art movies or the foreign movies. So next slide. So the Wilma building was built by somebody Simons, I think. And he was the first husband of Edna Wilma. He was a promoter. He had theaters around the state and the region. And so when he died pretty early in their marriage, she took over. And apparently she was a really astute businesswoman. So she had like 7 theaters in Idaho and Montana and all over. And even though she was in her 50s, I believe, she met Ed Sharp, who was 20 years younger. So maybe she was in her 40s. Anyway, she met a younger man named Ed Sharp. They got married in New York City in 1950, and then he came back and started managing the buildings with her, and especially the Wilma Theater. Next slide. There's Edna Wilma. She was a former light opera star. And then next slide. And there's Ed Sharp. Now, he had the distinction, probably after she was gone, of getting really obsessed with pigeons. There were a lot of pigeons on the Wilma building. And so he cultivated this particular pigeon that he called Koru Hatu. And if you went to a movie, even in the big room, or later in the Chapel of the Dove downstairs, he would oftentimes have the pigeon on his shoulder, and before the movie started, you've already paid, you're sitting there, and you would have to listen to him play the organ in a tribute to Korohatu before you got to watch the movie. And it got to be a thing. It's like, okay, that's kind of, okay. Price of admission. Next slide. So he developed the Chapel of the Dove, I think in 1982, and it went till like 1981 or like about 10-year period. He decorated the Chapel of the Dove in the basement to replicate a chapel that he and Edna Wilma got married in New York, which is interesting. So there was like mirror balls and Clark, like ostrich feathers, a lot of ostrich feathers. Anyway, next slide. Here's my family, along with Elizabeth. So that's myself, that's my husband, that's my good friend Suzanne Gott, and then there's Indigo, my daughter. And then the guy that runs the Roxy now was actually in the audience. He's here, Mike Steinberg, and his friend Steve Kelly. And there's Korohatu. So we were watching, this is typical of the movies we would see, like Gone with the Wind in this room. Okay, next slide. And to conclude, I've been living in and around Arlie for almost 50 years, and one of the things I've loved is the powwows that happen on July 4th. First one I ever went to was in 1973. And they have evolved over the past 50 years. They're quite much better attended, much more organized, and no alcohol, and very positive community event. So Queen Elizabeth wanted to visit that. Next slide. And this is an older group. So I have to say that they're not sure when the powwow started in Arlie, but they think the first official one they know of was 1898. They think they were happening before then, but at that time it was illegal for them to dance their dances. So that's part of why I think they picked July 4th, because it's like, okay, who's going to complain about dancing on July 4th? So there's some speculation the powwows were starting in the early 1890s. But anyway, so next slide. So this is from one of the powwows, and I love the jingle dresses. And one of the things that's typical of the powwows is the concession stand. So they have people coming in that sell beaded objects or snow cones or whatever. And so Queen Elizabeth wanted to visit, but she was hungry. Next slide. Oh, sorry. There's also a lot of teepees that are set up in the vicinity. And that's of Sugar Shack, which you'll see inspired this painting. Next slide. There it is. Okay. So it was typical, and I used some of the photography I had done of the costumes of the people there. Anyway, so this is just about the end of the slideshow. Next one. Oh no! Oh, this is like another bonus painting. So in the period at 2016, when I had the show at the Art Museum of the entire group, I needed another painting for the art auction, and so I decided to do a painting that was freestanding that could be bid on. And next slide. So here she is. She's all by herself on the hiking trail at Holland Lake. Yeah, next slide. So I want to thank, we're going to continue, but I want to thank Humanities Montana especially for sponsoring this program where I could come and talk with you. And retroactively, the Arts Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, and West Staff for the original Caravan project, because it's it's 30 years later, I'm still talking about the work that I was inspired by that event. So thank you. And then the last would be my mother, who's recently passed away, but she was a big supporter of what I was doing and would be here today if she could, yeah. So, okay. So now we can just turn that off if that's possible. Maybe just close that. Okay, so this part, according to like what I'm doing, is asking, so the thing is, any of you could have stories that you would want to illustrate the way that I have. And especially if they're around quirky Montana things or unusual, like Steve, Steve was talking to me 20 some years ago. He was 30 years ago, 20 years, 30. Yeah, he was talking about the Governor Marr, is that right? And he fell off of a steamboat, but there was some question of whether he was pushed or he fell. I mean, that kind of stuff's very interesting to me.
Oh, yeah, the vigilantes were very active during that.
In the early statehood period. Yeah, and I can't remember her name now, but Carrie, the woman that was the black postmistress in the Helena. Yeah. I mean, I did a lot of research about her, and she's fascinating. And it's like one of the paintings I haven't had time to do. The paintings take a long time. A lot of them were 100 to 200 hours, especially the ones of all the crowd scenes. Yeah.
I'm disappointed Queen Elizabeth wasn't doing a hoop dance or the circle dance at the
She might take that up. She does have what would be called regalia. Yeah, so I think that she'd qualify if they're in one of the ones that are all open to everybody. Yes?
After Corohato died, Eddie had the pigeon stuffed, and so you could still posthumously visit.
So the question is, what happened? I'm curious. Yeah. I'll have to buy a future thing. Yeah.
Does the chapel still exist?
No, it's sad. I was just going to say that. And so unfortunately, after Sharp died, I don't know who his heirs were. They didn't have children. But the building sold. And that whole area, that was in the basement, all got renovated. So like where Mary Ann's restaurant was, or, like it's all, Scotty's. Yeah, where Scotty, like that whole area was just wiped out. And it makes me sad because there's been a number of very interesting, I'd call installations, that when the person's died, the family or no one's there to protect it. And Marcus Wolf had an amazing art park way off Broadway. And again, after he died, the family couldn't handle it and they just sold everything off. So that's probably just kind of a common fate, but it's nice when some of those things continue after the person's gone. Yeah?
In that very first picture when you were 10 in Paris, in the darker blue dress, was that your mother next to you?
No.
Oh.
No, I mean, my parents were pretty laissez-faire. I think my dad took the photo, but my mom was probably looking at artwork. I don't know. No.
I just noticed that person was a redhead.
Oh.
Was your mother redhead?
No, blonde. I'll show you. I'll show
Was Queen Elizabeth a redhead?
What?
Was Queen Elizabeth
She was a redhead. I have to apologize for my hair. I wanted to go to a beauty parlor. I never go to a beauty parlor, but 2 years ago when I was in Lewistown, I did, and they fixed it up kind of really nicely. But I wasn't prepared to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go do that. So, and then my husband and I looked online last night, and it's like she had red hair, which I don't, and it was really curly. So I couldn't have approximated that anyway. So, but okay, yeah. So any questions about
There's so many paintings that you've done. Were they all in the peep show boxes?
Well, the only ones that weren't were those ones that I did for the art museum's fundraiser. So the only ones, and that's one of the reasons I'm really thrilled to do this, because honestly, the one of Queen Elizabeth on the hiking trail and the one where she's congratulating Dempsey and Gibbons, you can look at those all the time. They're just on the wall with glass over them. But these only come to life when I bring them, either I show them through this, which is, I appreciate slideshows. I'm a big fan of slideshows, but I think nothing can replace actually looking at art in real life and seeing the canvas or seeing the paper or seeing the metal and walking around it or getting up close to it or away. And so the peep shows really only come to life if I assemble them and bring them to an event like this. So that's a drawback. I mean, I've considered maybe taking them out of the boxes and framing them so they would be conventionally displayed, but I'm not prepared to do that because I think there's something, I mean, those kids having such a strong response, there's something about interacting with the art. And you're in control. You're in control of when the light goes on. You're in control of how long you look at it. And one last thing I have to say about the paintings is, when I was on the board at the Art Museum in Missoula, they did a study, or they talked about a study about how long people actually look at art when they go into a museum or a gallery. It's really brief period. It's like seconds. They like look and then they go walk on. So what I love about the peep shows is you're flipping that switch and you're only seeing it. You're not seeing other artwork. You're not seeing somebody with a cup of coffee. You're looking at the art. So it's this very more intense experience. So that's part of why I haven't turned them into frame pieces for now. Yeah?
Are you related to Henry VIII?
I am. Actually, no, this sounds weird. Okay, so really when you get back to like what inspired this whole series, so I have a studio in a building downtown in Missoula, and I've been using it since the 70s. And I work up there by myself, and it used to be that there weren't many other people in the building. Now it's well occupied. But I was up there in the 80s all by myself, and I started thinking about my genetic heritage, which is predominantly British. There's some Dutch, but it's mostly English and Welsh and Scotch, you know, like this big mixture. And I must have been in a funny mood. I was like, well, you know, actually genetically, I might have some modest connection to Queen Elizabeth or one of her relatives or whatever, because the population levels were much smaller. And then I went, well, you know, that's probably not really likely, but maybe one of my ancestors was in a field when she was on that progress or whatever they would do, and they would go from one castle to the next. And they would be, I mean, it wasn't like now where you can sort of hide out behind Lear jets and bulletproof glass and stuff like that. You know, the people were more in their community. They had to be, because they were reliant on them for everything. So I was like, I was in my studio, and I was like, I could feel Elizabethan England. I could feel it. And I think that's where it's like, oh, I'd like to dress up as the queen. Maybe I'm not the queen, but it's nice to be able to. That's the great thing about being an artist. You can really exercise your imagination. So, yeah?
Did you say that you create your outfit?
No. So the frustrating thing is I've got these patterns that I bought. With a lot of work, I found patterns for her style of clothing in the 90s, but they were extremely elaborate. So I was lucky, my husband had a store called Carlo's One Night Stand. It was before you guys moved here, and Carlo's was a great supplier to everybody, but especially the art community and younger people. He had a lot of costumes, he had vintage clothes, and so I was lucky enough that he had this in his inventory. And I have to say, it's a little small on me, so it's... What?
You never paid for it.
I never paid for it. No, and I have added, I've embellished it a bit, but it's not the colors I would choose if it was, you know, if I had 100% choice, and I may still have a dress made, but it's starting to seem a little ambitious. Yeah, so, and any other questions? Anybody have an incident that would lend itself? Yeah?
Your Highness?
Yes.
I'm just wondering where your future vacations are going to take you. Where are you going?
I'm sort of interested in Canada right now. And in fact, with everything that's going on, I was like, I think my grandmother's family was in Canada, and that she moved down to Detroit to marry my grandfather. I was like, oh, that's kind of intriguing. No, anyway, I'm supportive of Canada, so yeah. Yeah, and anything, yeah?
So this original caravan that you were a part of, is that still going on? Or was it taken over by various art fairs that happened? Or?
No, I have to say, I want to give credit to the 13 artists that participated in it, and especially my friend Renee that came up with the idea, because at the time she was trying to do it, it was really ahead of its time. I mean, if we had proposed that idea 10 or 15 years ago, it would have been like a slam dunk, and now it's, I've got, now it would be okay, but at the time, we really had to figure everything out, And the granting we got was good, but it wasn't really adequate to the amount that everybody spent. I mean, it was driving all over the state. I mean, hundreds of miles and a lot of work and very, very fulfilling. But we didn't do it. We talked about trying to do it a second time, but by the time we were considering a second go at it, gas prices had started going up, and there was a lot more talk about the impact of being on the road. Then artists are sensitive, so I think that sort of killed it. But I'm sorry. We had a reunion this summer, which was really fulfilling. It was really fulfilling, and it just reminded me how important it was. And I think we influenced a whole generation, especially of Montana children, who came to those events. It's like, look, you can do this. It's fun. It's like.
So it's just your group of 13
Yeah.
traveling around, and you set up booths and
So yeah,
presentations in each town?
yeah. So some of the towns we went to, Great Falls was like a big one. We went to Moccasin, which was tiny. And we would use, Renee and some of the other artists help make those connections with those art centers. Generally, we're the people that sponsored it. But I would say one of the things I was impressed, there was an artist named Joe Batt, who's now in Washington State, and he did a portable graveyard. So he would set up a little fence, and then he was a ceramic artist. He'd set up a fence, and then he had tombstones that were of colorful characters, and maybe, I don't know, were they based on real life people, or, yeah, they were like part of Montana history, probably.
Did you document?
I did, and a lot of the people did, and in fact, I have a book that I got a grant to produce for the show at the Art Museum 10 years ago, and there's an essay in there that is about the Caravan Project, because it was so fundamental, and that was written by my friend that started at Renee. So I could send you a link to that, or you could buy the book, or but there hasn't been much documentation of it. I think that's, time moves on, and we were all busy, and everybody got even more enmeshed in their careers after that. So it's limited, but there are slides around. At some point, it would be a great book or a project for somebody doing a master's thesis. Yeah. Yeah?
So Queen Elizabeth was quite remarkable, but when did you first become interested in her?
I think it was when I did this. Okay, so true confession. I was interested in genetics, and I was interested in art when I was in college. And the art won out, because with art you have a lot more freedom. I didn't have to worry about being part of a corporation or a school or anything like that. I just did what I wanted to do. But I had an interest in genetics, and that's part of how Science Woman evolved. It was because I had, okay, what's the scientific approach? How do scientists solve problems? Let's test that theory. So when I had that vision of Queen Elizabeth, it was based on this kind of sense of genetics. And I think it was that I was revisiting science in my own way. It sounds odd, but yeah.
Will Science Woman ever meet Queen Elizabeth?
And then I'd have to figure out how to be in two places at once. or some kind of thing. I'd have to get Dr. D back from the dead. So I just want to say, so we have two, oh yes?
Well, maybe some previous science women in training could figure that out.
I want to. Mike and Joe Jakubczyk were instrumental in working with me when I was doing a lot of Science Woman performing. We performed at the University of Montana with Dr. Science, and the two of them were my assistants. They were in many of my slideshows. They're very loyal. Science Woman in training, and he went so far as to put his hair in a bun. Yeah. Okay, so there was two of the peep shows back there. If you want to test them out, they've been freshly painted. You can just flip the switch. One of Jack Dempsey and Tommy Gibbons. The other one is, of course, Traveler's Rest. Yeah.
So, I want to make sure that everybody has time to look at the peep shows and to visit the table over here and take a look at the postcards in the book. I have to say personally that I first learned of this project at the Art Museum. I was there with my young children, and my younger son, I have to say, I'm an art museum nerd, and my younger son really is not. And there are pictures of him draped over benches in art museums all over North America. But we bought a copy of the book from the art museum exhibit, and it had instructions for making your own peep show from a shoebox. And that was a project that he was willing to get into with me. So I thank you very much. And our copy is in one of the cases back there on display as part of this Lewis and Clark and Pop Culture and Art exhibit that's in the room right now. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to also let folks know, if you saw on your chairs these little flyers, we currently have an auction online. We're calling it Timeless Treasures. A few of the items are here on this table, but there are some artwork that are currently on display at the Missoula Symphony Orchestra offices. We will be there for First Friday, this Friday, March 7th, and there are some vintage lithographs by an artist, last name is Fuertes, and he was a naturalist, and also some reproductions of works by Carl Rungius, and we're hoping to raise a little bit of money, so stop by and see us on First Friday, make a bid, or check it out online. The QR code is on here. Everybody in Zoom land, thank you very much for being here.
Did they have any questions?
No, there were no questions from the Zoom line.
Okay.
So I think a lot of people wanted to see the peep shows in person,
Well,
so
that-
they came here instead of joining us on Zoom.
That is important. So I'm going to make a little plug. This is a challenging time in the country and the world. And my personal thing is artists exercise freedom of expression. It's a really critical component of democracy. So if you are curtailing or limiting your spending, but you have a little money, support the local artist, okay? It's really crucial because otherwise things are so expensive in Missoula, especially housing. Those people are gonna go away. And so to help keep those opportunities available for people, it's really important. And I appreciate this. And thank you, Humanities Montana. Thank you for Travelers Rest.
Yeah, thanks to you as well.